Welcome to Phenomenon Radio with John Burroughs and Linda Moulton Howe. And leading off the program, here's Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist Linda Moulton Howe.
Today is July 30th, 2015, and John Burroughs is 55 years old. He was born on July 30th, 1960 in Illinois, and on his 18th birthday, John entered the United States Air Force. After basic training in Lackland, Texas, he was assigned to security at NATO's largest air base at the time, RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge in Woodbridge, England. That's where John was exposed up close to non-ionizing radiation from an unidentified aerial phenomenon, or UFO, on two different nights, December 26th and 28th, 1980. But John did not know that then. All he knew was that not long after he and others encountered strange aerial lights and beams in Rendlesham Forest near the base, that at age 20, John was diagnosed with a heart murmur and eye damage that he did not have when he enlisted 2 years before. It was not until February 2011 that John became suddenly very ill, was hospitalized and diagnosed with atrial fibrillation of unknown origin because his VA doctor in Phoenix, Arizona, where he lived then, did not find any clogged arteries or congenital heart defects, and they were stumped about why a 51-year-old, otherwise healthy man was deteriorating so rapidly. John told the VA doctor about his heart murmur diagnosis in England. The doctor wanted to see those records, but when John went to the Veterans Administration in Phoenix for his RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge medical records, eventually after many delays, he was told his medical records were classified. In a catch-22 twist, the VA also denied John medical benefits because his records were classified and not available. By 2013, John was desperate for help that unexpectedly came from a CIA medical source behind the scenes who told John's VA doctor that the heart problem was linked to exposure to a specific kind of non-ionizing radiation that had damaged John's mitral valve leaflets. Further, John came to understand that the UK MOD's Defense Intelligence Analysts working under a Project Condign, had studied non-ionizing radiation impacts on human tissues and minds after exposure to UFOs, and had submitted a 460-page scientific and technical report in December 2000 classified secret UK eyes only. The title of that report is, quote, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, UAP, in the UK Air Defence Region, Scientific and Technical Memorandum, close quote. UFO was changed to UAP, probably to bypass FOIA requests for information about UFOs. For reasons unknown, the whole document was quietly unclassified in 2006 without the public knowing. But when John and his attorney, Pat Frasconia, started reading the Project Condign report, in Appendix F, page F4, under Potential Mental Effects on Humans, about tissue damage within various distances from UAP sources from peculiar non-ionizing radiation, these two sentences stood out, quote, The well-reported Rendlesham Forest Bentwaters event is an example where it might be postulated that several observers were probably exposed to UAP radiation for longer than normal UAP sighting periods. It is clear that the recipients of these effects are not aware that their behavior, perception of what they are observing is being modified, close quote. With that new information, but still without the VA settling his medical claim because his Bentwaters medical records were classified, On December 18, 2013, retired U.S. Air Force Tech Sergeant John Burroughs had life-saving open heart surgery to implant a new mitral valve, and the doctors confirmed that one leaflet was disintegrating and one was shredded.
My claim was based on the fact that I was injured in the line of duty, that I became sick right after the incident, which was the reason why I had my heart issues. Here's the Condign proof that this incident happened. And not only that, but the Condign proof shows that my heart was damaged by whatever I was exposed to in the forest in 1980. I didn't feel good right after the incident, and I struggled with different things, vision, throat. It's after I returned to the States 4 or 5 months later that, again, I got sick just out of the blue, and I went into the civilian hospital. My heart was not acting properly. They found a heart murmur, and there was an abnormal anomaly in the heart. And the interesting thing about that, which I didn't know at the time, but I've learned over the years, is a lot of times when they find this anomaly in the heart and when they do an EKG and stuff like that, that leads to that you have some kind of heart blockage. But I've never had that. Matter of fact, prior to my surgery, they checked for that in case they were going to have to clean out my arteries, and they were clean. I have no heart disease, no heart problems, no nothing. The only heart problem I have was both of my leaflets were shredded, but the one that normally doesn't even have any damage in mitral valve was completely shredded, which was on the inside mitral valve, and that was causing all my heart issues.
Since his December 18, 2013 open heart surgery, John Burroughs has recovered. And finally, in January of this year, he received full medical benefits from the Veterans Administration because of the valiant efforts of Arizona U.S. Senator John McCain's staff, and filed a lot of FOIA requests with the Ministry of Defense for more information about the non-ionizing radiation exposure detailed in the MOD's Project Condign report. John was surprised when in fall 2014, less than a year ago, he received an admission from the MOD that it has withheld 18 UAP UFO-related and highly classified files from being transferred to the UK National Archive. For all that work, John received the 2015 Researcher of the Year Award at the Open Minds International UFO Congress in Fountain Hills, Arizona, on February 21st, 2015. After John asked the MOD when the 18 UAP UFO files would be released, the earliest date suggested was fall 2016. But then Lord Guy Black of Brentwood in the UK House of Lords followed up in March and July this year with questions to UK Defence Minister Earl Howe. On July 3rd, only 3 weeks ago, Lord Black in Parliament asked, quote, in relation to the 18 MOD files on unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP, that have yet to be released to the public, what is the originating division of the file reference capital M 9/18 ? What is the remit of that division in relation to UAP? And what is the MOD's latest estimate of when the 18 files will be passed to the National Archives and then released to the public, close quote. Defense Minister Earl Howe replied, quote, the originating branch of file reference M9/18 Defense Policy Issues UFOs relates to ministers' private offices. The latest estimate of when the 18 files will be delivered to the National Archives is before March 2016. Then the National Archives will make the necessary judgment about when it will release these files to the public, close quote. So we have two mysteries. What are ministers' private offices, and when before March 2016? It's now only 7 months until the 1st of March 2016. With us tonight on our first Phenomenon Radio broadcast is former UK Ministry of Defense staffer Nick Pope, who was hired right out of high school back in 1985 at age 20. Nick's father also worked for the MOD and was instrumental in Nick's recruitment. During Nick Pope's 21 years inside the Ministry of Defense, Secretariat Air Staff 2A, Nick was officially assigned for 3 years in 1991 to 1994 to run the so-called UFO project that included a UFO phone hotline for public sightings reports. Nick retired from the MOD in 2006 and has since worked as a freelance journalist to write about UFOs, other explained mysteries, and conspiracy theories for various newspapers and magazines. Nick also co-authored a recent 2014 book with John Burroughs and James Peniston entitled Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, the Inside Story of the World's Best Documented UFO Incident. John Burroughs and I have joined up together to share on a weekly basis the complex, multi-layered chessboard that is the matrix behind what John and others experienced in England 35 years ago. Even the December 1980 Deputy Base Commander Colonel Charles Halt has described the lights and beams phenomena that he saw himself as, quote, extraterrestrial in origin, close quote. Next up, after this short break, Phenomenon Radio host John Burroughs will be joined by Nick Pope for the rest of the hour to talk about what could be in those 18 UFO UAP documents and policy files that the MOD is still keeping secret, and where exactly are those secret files?
And with that, we're taking our first break. We'll be right back, folks. Don't go anywhere with our very special guest, Nick Pope, right after these messages.
Explaining the unexplained. The new UnXNetwork.com. Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio with Linda Moulton Howe, John Burroughs, and tonight's very special guest coming up, Nick Pope. To find out more on the show, visit earthfiles.com and phenomenonradio.com, and there you'll find all you need to follow along with the show. All right, here is John Burroughs.
Thanks, Race. Good evening, Nick. How are you tonight?
I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Linda and I really appreciate you coming on our debut show, and we've got a lot to cover, so let's dive right into it. Let's start with, we're going to talk about the MOD files, the 18 files that they've held back. But before we get too deep into that, for listeners that may not know a lot about it, can you give us a couple of minutes and describe a little bit when the MOD started releasing files, why they did it, how they went along with it, and when they said they ended it? Could you go into that for a couple of minutes?
Sure thing. When the UK got its Freedom of Information Act, the Ministry of Defense soon found that they were getting more requests about UFOs than any other subject. Requests were coming in left, right, and center from journalists, the UFO community, and ordinary members of the public who were just fascinated in what might be in the files. So because of the administrative workload of dealing with all that on a case-by-case basis, the MOD decided to proactively push the material into the public domain at the National Archives. And the first batch of files was released in May 2008, and they released subsequent 9 batches. Then in June 2013, they said, okay, that's it. That's all of them. Then, as you well know, because you were really one of the people who brought out the fact that this was not the case, it transpired that there were 18 more files that the MOD, they say they'd forgotten about them, weren't aware of them. However, they phrased it. There were delays and delays. Timescales were given as to when those files might be released. They came and went. Now it looks as if they might be released sometime next spring 2016. But in the world of government bureaucracy, who knows?
Okay, now I've got a question for you, because you were involved during some of the releases as far as you were a spokesman for National Archives, correct?
Yes, that's right. I mean, because I wrote some of these files, of course. I mean, some of the documents have my signature at the bottom. Because of that, I was involved in that whole process. I helped them pick out some cases to highlight. I did a promotional video for them, which is out there on YouTube somewhere. And of course, each time subsequent batches come out, I go on, well, CNN, BBC, whoever it is, and I kind of basically, talk people through what these latest documents are, what our thinking was at the Ministry of Defense, how we viewed this subject, how we viewed the UFO community even. So, it's been something of a blast from the past for me personally. I mean, when I was working on all of this, of course, back on my time on the UFO project in the early 90s, I didn't think any of this would come out until long after I'd retired. I mean, 30, 40 years downstream. The UK, when I was doing this job, did not have a Freedom of Information Act. It was one of Tony Blair's big flagship ideas.
Okay, so when they made their final announcement and they said they were done, they released everything, being that you were involved in all this behind the scenes, like you said, you even were involved in writing some of these files, you knew that they weren't telling the truth, correct?
Well, I certainly thought, well, wait a minute, this sounds odd. I don't think everything's been released, but there have been 10 batches. I'd moved in the interim from the United Kingdom to the United States, so I'd slightly taken my eye off the ball. I knew, as did everyone, that some material was certainly being redacted quite heavily, all the usual exemptions that apply: national security, defense, intelligence. So I wasn't 100% sure whether there was a gap or not. I suspected there was, but it wasn't really appropriate for me to contradict my former employer and say, wait a minute, have we really done all of this? So I had to take what they were saying at face value.
Understand.
As it turns out, of course, that was wrong. And we've now had confirmed in Parliament, of course, that these files have yet to be released.
Okay, so going along those lines, okay, why, you worked in the MOD, why would they make it a point to emphasize that they released everything and not? Why? Why do you feel they did that?
Well, I don't know whether it's genuine bureaucratic mix-up. I mean, in all of these Ministry of Defense positions, people get posted in and out every couple of years, and the civilian employees are no different from the military. So very often the person finishing a job is not the person that's starting it. It's a recipe for confusion. Now, I don't know whether there was any duplicity there, any malice, or not. I mean, I want to give my former employees the benefit of the doubt here. I mean, I worked for them for 21 years, and they are pretty much a bunch of good people.
Right, but as we all know, that the actual people that do the release aren't necessarily the one that makes the final call on what is and isn't released, correct?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the other point with all of this. There's a kind of chain of custody of all this. The subject matter experts who actually worked on the UFO project, and of course, bear in mind, that was terminated in December 2009, so there is now no Ministry of Defense subject matter expert on UFOs itself. There are a whole bunch of people looking at the freedom of information aspects, but that's one point. The other point, of course, is that two different parts of the government are now involved, and they have totally different agendas. The Ministry of Defense regards UFOs as a bad news story. They'd rather the whole thing went away. They, publicly speaking anyway, got out of the game in December 2009. They would rather draw a line under the whole thing. To the National Archives, it's a good news story. They even charge money off of it. It's about £3.50 per file. So they've got an agenda to push this. So when you've got two parts of government with different agendas pushing in directly opposite directions, you do get this kind of snafu.
But Nick, don't you think it is really significant that of those 18 that are withheld, at least a half dozen are policy files, and that one, M918, specifically in that discussion between Lord Black and the MOD minister is, it says M9/18, Defense Policy Issues UFOs. That means that is at the heart of whatever the UK Ministry of Defense is looking at in terms of defense policy about UAPs, UFOs.
Well, I think the Defense Intelligence Staff policy files, of which, as you say, there are several in this next and final batch, are actually going to be more interesting than that M file. The M there stands for ministerial, as in ministerial correspondence. So actually, if people are expecting that to be the most exciting file, they'll probably be a little disappointed. My take is that that is ministerial correspondence. In other words, when questions are raised in Parliament by an MP or by a Lord, so the House of Commons or the House of Lords, the two houses of British Parliament, what you then get is internal discussion amongst officials. This question has been asked by this member of Parliament. Why are they asking? What's behind this? How will we respond in such a way that is truthful but shows us in the best possible light? So it's that kind of correspondence. The Defense Intelligence Staff policy files are, I think, going to be the more interesting of the lot. And that is basically, I worked in the policy division. We handled the setting in the policy, and we had the investigative lead. Defense Intelligence Staff provided scientific and technical intelligence advice on the wider UFO issue. And it's their policy files that are possibly causing the headache about how the MOD is going to push this final batch into the public domain.
So what are the minister's private offices?
Basically, all the ministers, so the Secretary of State for Defense, the Minister of State for the Armed Forces, and the various undersecretaries, they all have a staff of about half a dozen. There's a private secretary who's kind of like, think of them as a chief of staff, controlling access, really being the main interface. There's a military advisor. There's a diary secretary, an appointments secretary, a correspondence clerk, that sort of thing. It's just as just as the Secretary of State for Defense, SecDef, would have in the DoD, a small private office staff really managing their whole workload, prioritizing, advising, saying, we have received this correspondence, you are due to appear in front of the House Armed Forces Committee, whatever it is. These are the questions they're likely to ask. These are the recommended lines to take. So that's what the private office staff do. So that M file is going to be discussions along those lines in relation to the UFO issue.
One of the things that I noted when I received these 18 files, it was very interesting. At one point, they called it UFO files. Then they changed it over to UAP files. Why?
I think a couple of reasons. Firstly, way back in about 1993, when I was doing work which eventually evolved into what we know as Project Condign, we had to do an internal selling job, as it were. I mean, as you can imagine, competition within the department for resources is scarce. And if you go to the financiers and say, we'd like to spend tens of thousands of dollars of taxpayers' money on a study into UFOs, there are going to be people who say, well, wait a minute, isn't Iraq or Bosnia kind of more important? And that would be a difficult argument to have. So we changed the phraseology, really, as a sleight of hand to end up with something that didn't have the cultural baggage that the phrase UFO had. So we would say, yeah, we want to do some UAP research into unidentified aerial phenomena. They are seen by our pilots. They show up on radar. And we would try to get through entire government documents on this without once mentioning the phrase UFO. It almost became a game. I mean, a piece of fun to do this, but there was a serious side. Then there was a kind of, I suppose you'd term it an unintended benefit of this, that it perhaps made it more difficult for people to make Freedom of Information Act requests about UFOs, because a lot of the good stuff would be termed UAP, and the answer might be, well, that's not what you asked for. Now, I don't know for sure whether they did that, and the Information Commissioner in the United Kingdom would have to rule on whether that was legal circumnavigation or you know what. So I don't know, but I suspect that whether by accident or design, it made it more difficult for the UFO community, for journalists, to get the really good stuff. Because they were asking, they were just using the wrong term.
Okay, what was the highest level of clearance you held when you held when you were in that job for 3 years? What was the highest level you were at?
Well, I had a TSI code word clearance, which I actually got before I was seconded onto UFOs. When I was posted onto UFOs. I actually got my TSSCI clearance for what you would call, I guess, the first Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War, the invasion, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 and the subsequent war. So I was involved as a briefer, a watchkeeper in the Air Force operations room during that. That's when I picked up my TSSCI clearance. And now, thinking back to that, which I held, I think I had it for 10 years until it needed to be renewed or something, and then I was in a different job when I didn't need it. So that's the clearance that I had for the UFO job. Now, there were all sorts of additional clearances that I was read on to, which gave me very specific things like, I can't remember, access maybe to satellite imagery or some things like that. I cannot tell you with hand on heart, thinking back to it now, what half of those were even called. I mean, they were just extra. They were just extra things. You've probably been through this or something very similar, because I imagine that the U.S. situation is broadly analogous to the UK one. My last day in that particular division, I think I had to go to an office and be formally de-indoctrinated. But I mean, what these things were called, I don't know, and if I did, I probably wouldn't be allowed to say. But yeah, it was TSSCI.
Okay, now, all right. Most of these documents that have been declassified, okay, sent to the National Archives, and some of them are still classified, and I want to go into that later, but they're all secret, correct?
Well, by volume, I mean, don't forget, we've now had over 55,000 pages of documents released from May 2008 to the present. Most of that is actually unclassified because, of course, most of that comes from the public itself, and self-evidently we can't classify something that's been sent in to us, which someone might have, for all we know, side-copied to the newspapers. The internal policy documents, particularly from the Defense Intelligence Staff, yes, a lot of that tends to be either secret or, in some cases, secret UK eyes only. And I'm sure we'll get on to Project Condign, but of course a lot of that was at that level too.
Okay.
Well, Nick, you were there in that 2000 to 2006 period. It was handed over to the MOD in December of 2000, and then completely quietly under the radar without the public knowing, it was unclassified, all 460 pages in 2006. That's when you retired. In those 6 years, did you hear about this amazing UAP report about non-ionizing radiation being able to injure human tissue and manipulate human minds at certain distances?
I knew that it had been done. I knew that it had been, the study had happened and the final report had been written up, but I had not seen a copy of it, because while I had a very high security clearance, what I'd lost, of course, was the need to know, which runs in parallel with that. So I only actually got to read a copy maybe a month or two before it was actually put out there. And the reason I got that early warning was because the Ministry of Defense knew that because details of my work had been made public under FOI, the Ministry of Defense knew that the media would come to me. I'd picked up this nickname, the real Fox Mulder, all that, which was a bit of fun. But the ministry knew that I would get asked about that, and so I was given an advance copy to read. But no, I hadn't seen it because,
Nick,
of course, yeah.
Would you agree that upon reading Project Condign, this unidentified aerial phenomena report in all its 460 pages about ionizing radiation having impact on minds and bodies, that this is in effect confirmation by the UK MOD that unidentified aerial phenomena / UFOs are very real and that they can have impact on Earth life?
Absolutely. And I have written, I think, a number of pieces where I've said the UFO community talks often about disclosure. Well, this is it. It may not be disclosure with a big D, president going on TV, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone. But it's certainly, yes, I think there's a case to be made for saying that this is disclosure with a little d. And as you well know, pretty much the thing starts off by saying that UAP exist is indisputable. And it goes on to make some extremely bullish statements on this and some extremely provocative statements, particularly when it gets into, of course, weaponization. But as ever, if you dump into the public domain an intelligence document, even in redacted form like this, most journalists will only have time to skim the executive summary. I mean, it was written by an intelligence officer for an audience which consists, of people in the intelligence community. So it didn't surprise me that the media and the UFO community didn't really kind of grasp the full significance of this thing. But I agree, it's an absolute bombshell, and there certainly is a case for saying, yeah, this is disclosure of a sort.
Yes, and John and I and his attorney, Pat Frasconia, we've talked about the whole issue of this 460 pages, basically explaining why the leaflets in the mitral valve of John Burroughs would have been one disintegrating and one shredded back in 1980 and causing him all of the heart problems later in his life, because they now know that this very specific frequency can do this kind of damage, and that if there had not been some sort of help to his VA doctor, then they were at a loss to understand what was happening. And in the March of this year, I had been doing interviews with John and with Pat about the fact that he had this big breakthrough. He got a full medical disability with the VA finally. He had been able to get that award for doing this pressure on the MOD and getting the admission on the withheld documents. And here was 460-page Project Condign's unidentified aerial phenomena about all of this non-ionizing radiation that would be at the heart of the mystery of the phenomena, not only in Rendlesham, but in many other places. And it was after several broadcasts, there was some buzz on the internet saying about this statement that he still, in spite of all of this, getting the VA disability and all, that his medical records from RAF Bantwaters Woodbridge are still classified to this day. And there was a lot of buzz on the internet about, well, could this be true, and why and how could it be classified? And it was on the evening of March 13th, 2015, that John sent me an email with a reply header that was showing up in the above top secret thread under a discussion topic listed as, quote, U.S. DOD, Department of Defense, has confirmed, and I think what they mean is the UK MOD, have confirmed the UFO phenomenon is real. The thread discussion centered around the question, why would John Burroughs' medical records from RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge be classified, and was that legal? The name on that thread header at the ATS site was Kit Green. He's more formally known, Kit Green, as Christopher Kit Green, MD. Back in 1982, it was Dr. Green who was on a list called the Aviary. And this was a list of bird names unofficially put together by UFO investigators William Moore and Jamie Chandray as code names for a few anonymous whistleblowers and UFO researchers. And some on that list were professional investigators such as astronomer and author Jacques Vallée, and others were from counterintelligence trying to maintain the World War II policy of denial about extraterrestrial technologies and biological entities interacting with Earth, past and present. And Dr. Kit Green was listed as Blue Jay on that 1982 aviary list. And he admits that he worked and works for the Central Intelligence Agency. He worked in the past on remote viewing research and later became chief of biomedical sciences at General Motors. More recently, Dr. Green has worked as assistant dean of the Asia Pacific Division in the Wayne State School of Medicine and as professor of diagnostic radiology and psychiatry in the Detroit Medical Center. Here is Dr. Green's entire and extraordinary March 13th, 2015 statement, Nick. I'd like to go through it and then on the other side, get your perspective from all of your experience at the MOD.
Sure.
He begins, quote, "This is a reply to the entire thread, and I will only address two issues that are common throughout many comments on this thread. They are question number one, how can it be true that medical records such as John Burroughs could have been classified? Is this true? Is it sensible? What are the reasons? And question number two, what caused his injuries and several others present over the encounter with the odd air form, capitalized, that emitted the broadband non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation, question mark? It is true. His records, about 1,000 pages, and to this day, still many hundreds, were in fact legally classified. In my 46-year career as a medical officer and physician with CIA, including the Staff Officer, Chief of Medical Intelligence, Life Sciences Division, and Assistant National Intelligence Officer for Science and Technology, I had, until a year or so ago, only seen a handful of truly classified medical records. Those of Adolf Hitler, John Kennedy's autopsy, and recently, John Burroughs. The reason for classifying were different. When I was denied these records after many requests, even though I have continuously held top secret, sensitive, compartmented information clearances for almost 50 years, I was able to quickly determine that the reasons were quite simple. Medical records are not usually digital and are easily sequestered in multiple locations and almost impossible to find. These were and remain, except for recent years, in hard copy, scanned and separated from FOIA access and even my access. The reasons are, I was told by current DOD and VA records staff that, quote, inside the doctor's notes, the nursing notes, the specialist note are a myriad of references to special access projects, SAPs, and the names of other adjacent and ancillary programs and projects that cannot be disentangled and which could uncover active and recent projects unrelated to Rendlesham. The reasons are not necessarily related to Rendlesham, and not all the connections relate to Rendlesham, close quote. This makes some sense operationally, but no sense ethically. John was hurt. He needed care, then, often, and now. He had injuries we now understand are related to narrow radio frequency bandwidths that only in some cases in the past 5 years have become linked to the specific etiology of cardiac and other injury he suffered. There are likely other persons and other injuries. Yes, to question number 1, yes, his records were classified. Some remain classified. The reasons are not entirely ethical. Thank God that a couple of Senators, Kyle and McCain, have the guts to push to disentangle that which was legitimately classified from those records that were needed to make the right decision about injury sustained while on active duty, period. And he means December 26th and 28th, 1980 in Rendlesham Forest. It was true. It is sensible. It is not entirely the stuff to make us physicians very proud. Question number 2. Broadband non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation caused the injuries. The radio frequency is identified in a dozen classified and a half dozen unclassified studies on cardiological and neurological injuries, not thousands of reports. Very, very few physicians even care about this arcane area of research, and fewer know about the injuries sustained by near field to humans. And that is about, in the report of, or this thread, he defines it as about the distance of a football field of about 328 feet. And you see that also in Project Condign. That is the distance that you need to be away from a UAP. If you're in 328 feet, you can suffer mental manipulation and damage to tissue. The data is sparse. It is not properly peer-reviewed. It is not understood. It is not the subject of current research, and that is the truth. The decision that was made to grant medical disability to John was just. Some of his records will remain classified. Those of us in military and intelligence medicine can be proud the right decision was finally, if belatedly, made, meaning his heart surgery. We should remain both vigilant and ashamed that our profession remains improperly darkened, and we should bring it to the light when we can. Disclosure statements. 1. I did not clear this short statement with John Burroughs, his attorney, anyone in my government, including my contracting officers, technical representatives. 2, I am a chief medical advisor to ATS, above top secret. 3, I own a fraction of a percent of stock in the above network LLC that owns and manages the above top secret website. I receive no compensation. Signed, Christopher C. Green, MD, PhD, FAAFS, on March 13th, 2015. Nick, what is your bottom line reaction to Kit Green's statement about all of this in the context of the 460-page Project Condign report about this damaging non-ionizing radiation?
Well, I think it's essentially a validation. Somebody with an extremely impressive CV, and I think what he's doing is saying, you know, for all the naysayers, yeah, this is pretty much what it says on the tin. There was a great deal of, I think, misunderstanding and misrepresentation about what happened with the VA and with John's situation. But I mean, I think the killer quote, of course, from Project Condign. I mean, and this is, perhaps I can just go back a step, because I think there is an interesting and wider issue about a degree of disagreement, perhaps, and maybe even bad blood between the US and the UK on this issue. And it goes right back to the handling of the Rendlesham Forest incident as it unfolded, of course, with dogfights over jurisdiction and such like, and particularly, as you know, with removal of evidence from the United Kingdom, which is certainly one of the key points in one of the most important documents from the MOD file, which talks about Commander-in-Chief, United States Air Force in Europe, taking items pertaining to the investigation out of the country without clearing it with the UK authorities, indeed without even informing the UK authorities. Now, the legacy of that decision maybe finally played itself out in the handling of John's tussle with the VA. The American government's position on this, the VA's line was, hey, you know, there's nothing to all this UFO subject. It's all nonsense. So, of course, how can we possibly settle a claim on the basis of someone who simply says that he's encountered something and it's harmed him? Then along comes Pat, John's lawyer, waving this obscure part of Project Condign's final report, Volume 2, Annex F, Working Paper 1, and he says, wait a minute. Look, here's a classified, highly classified British government document that says, quote, the well-reported Rendlesham Forest/Bentwaters event is an example where it might be postulated that several observers were probably exposed to UAP radiation for longer than normal UAP sighting periods.
And you know what, Nick? That implies that your government and our government knows that there are periods of exposure, some longer and shorter, and they have a lot of data on this.
Well, absolutely. It was, I mean, to say, you're quite right, to say that not only were these people probably irradiated, but they were irradiated, it seems, for longer than most people. Absolutely, it implies there's a whole body of data out there on that. But that's the interesting thing, of course, that it took this quote from Project Condign's final report, and then once Pat went to the VA with that, they were utterly and totally painted into a corner on it. And there could be no denial. I mean, there it was in black and white, secret UK eyes only report saying, yep, the Rendlesham people, the witnesses were probably exposed and irradiated.
So do you think that the 18 withheld files, if they come out between now and March, 7 months, will there be a lot of redaction?
Yes, I think there probably will be. Certainly, I mean, again, of course, all the fairly low-level stuff, the day-to-day sighting reports from the public, that's not going to be redacted. That's all unclassified. But if you're getting into discussions on the sorts of areas that we've been talking about, absolutely, either that or indeed the thing won't be released at all.
And will Lord Black or anybody in Parliament be able to leverage FOIA to find out what is in the redacted areas?
No, I don't think so.
Really?
It may be that the House of Commons Defence Committee might ask for that, and the Intelligence and Security Committee might ask for it. But again, it depends whether someone on those committees was prepared to step up to the plate on this issue. You know, we've discussed in the last couple of weeks what happens to members of Parliament and peers of the realm when they raise this issue. Lord Black so far has not been smeared for doing this, but we saw just a couple of weeks ago when a Conservative member of the Welsh Assembly raised an issue to do with UFOs, the Welsh government replied in Klingon. They made him a laughing stock.
And Project Condign, Nick, takes that and says, if you joke about this, then you have to confront 460 pages and open heart surgery. And that should be the end of that kind of sarcasm, because this is serious. This is phenomena. We have an alien presence on this planet. And you, Nick, I, and others going forward, I hope we can continue to shed facets on where RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge has 1,000 levels, and we have just begun tonight.
It should be the end of the sarcasm, but it won't be. It won't be. This is the game governments play with this. We saw it with Kucinich and his run for the nomination. We saw it with the recent reply in Klingon, and we'll see it again. And it doesn't matter how much good stuff is out there. If they want to ridicule it, they'll ridicule it. The trick, I think, will be to come at it from an open government point of view. The way that John Podesta is handling it, for example. That's the smart way to do it. I think it's the only way to do it successfully.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to take a break. I think we've been afforded a depth of what we're going to find on Phenomenon Radio in the future. We'll be right back with Linda Moulton Howe, John Burroughs, and tonight's special guest, Nick Pope, formerly of the MOD's UFO Project, right after these messages.
Alternative talk you can trust. The X.
Welcome back to the KGRA radio presentation of Phenomenon Radio with John Burroughs. Tonight's special guest, Nick Pope, is with us, and we're going right back to the show. John, it's all yours.
Thanks, Race. Nick, we covered a lot in the first hour, but before we go any further with the MOD 18 files and the Project Condign, like you said earlier, you wrote some articles on the importance of this, and within the articles, you talked a little bit about what secret, UKI's only secret meant, and you really didn't go into top secret, but before we go further, can you explain a little bit, A, what each one of those classifications mean, and how that UKI's only top secret tied in to Condign and how important it was?
Yeah, I don't have the definitions in front of me, and I don't know actually whether the exact wording is itself classified, which I know sounds Orwellian, but it's just the kind of Ministry of Defense bureaucracy that's probably the case. But top secret information is essentially information the disclosure of which would cause catastrophic damage to the national interest, including things like war, loss of life, major economic disaster, etc., etc. And it kind of ratchets down from there. Secret is information, the compromise of which would cause serious damage to the national interest, again, defined as potential, for example, for loss of life, and such like. The definitions may or may not be out there on the internet, so I'd better be a little bit careful around that one. But you get the drift. And again, the UK definitions are, I think, broadly analogous, or maybe even through NATO identical.
Okay. Now, Condign was classified what?
Secret UKIs only.
And
so
the reason, why do you think that was? Because you read the report, you were involved in the report. Why was it at that level?
My take is that it was the potential military applications of some of this. And that was something that was speculated about, not extensively, but significantly nonetheless. And the moment you start talking about potential military applications of a phenomenon, and let's not beat around the bush, what we're really talking about at the sharp end of this is weaponization, then you clearly get into an area which, A, you don't want people knowing about generally, but B, you certainly don't want unfriendly nations looking at and gaining some sort of scientific and technical advantage. I mean, there's a whole body of literature out there about the next generation of warfare. In fact, I think our mutual friend John Alexander wrote a book called Future War. Now, arguably, that was, I think, more about non-lethal weapons. But the point remains, there's a whole body of literature out there, and it covers areas maybe tangentially relevant to some of the things that we were discussing before the break. I mean, the nightmare scenarios that have been discussed, for example, about a targeted genetic bioweapon of some sort that could go after, I mean, it's sometimes called an ethnic bomb, but if that technology could be developed to a sufficient point, you might have a genetically targeted bioweapon that would go after a particular race or even a particular individual. So those are the sorts of things that are quite openly been discussed as theoretical possibilities. Well, we certainly don't want to tip anyone over the line when it comes to that one. Now, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I don't know.
Well, no,
I don't know what's out there and not.
But within the report itself, it does talk about different things involving weaponizing it, does it not?
Absolutely. And I mean, it talks particularly about directed energy weapons. Now, I think you've only got to look at the history of the UFO phenomenon to see a wide body of, again, literature talking about beams of light coming from these craft, striking individuals or striking the ground in front of individuals. I mean, we see that in Rendlesham, but we see it in other cases too. Now, if proper study of the data we already have on UFOs enables someone to essentially back engineer that technology, whatever the source of it, whatever these things are. But if someone can take the information we already have, and bear in mind the Ministry of Defense looked at this issue for, 58 years, something like that. There's a lot of data out there. If someone can make a weapon out of that, and particularly a directed energy weapon, well, that's huge.
So breaking that down a little bit, let's go into this, okay? The MOD at some point, and do you have any idea when they realized that this phenomena existed, number one? Number two, that they wanted to start studying it for weaponization. Do you have any idea when that time frame happened?
Well, I'm tempted to say the MOD knew that it existed and it was real right from the outset, right from the Foo Fighters in the Second World War to the ghost rockets of 1946 and 47. I'm tempted to say, yeah, right from the beginning we knew it was real, but we didn't know, and arguably still don't really know, what it is. I mean, you know something's real and tangible, but still not really understand what you're dealing with, and I think that was the situation and still is.
So, but basically they understand there's frequencies involved. They understand there's even a possibility that, stealth was mentioned in there, correct?
Yes,
stealth
absolutely.
Technology. And a lot of that involved radars and being able to get in and out and do different things, correct?
Yes.
So they understood the fact that you had this phenomena, and I'm going to read a little line that you talked about. Credited with the ability to hover, land, take off, accelerate to exceptional velocities and vanish. They can reportedly alter direction of flight, suddenly and clearly exhibit aerodynamic characteristics well beyond those of any known aircraft or missile, either manned or unmanned. Okay? So I guess my question to you is they asked the guy to study this. He was studying this based on things that have been done within the intelligence agencies themselves, classified documents that were there that they'd already looked into some of this. They looked into the radar, they looked into the ability for this to do this, and he was just summarizing what these documents said, correct?
That's correct, but he also went out, like any good intelligence community person would do, out into the literature. And so when you look at Project Condign, you have what to some people looks quite kind of, I don't know what the politically correct word is, so I'm not going to use it, but it looks like it's leaping around a number of different places sometimes, because clearly in parts of the report you can see that it has its roots in intelligence assessments from things that are in our own files. But in other parts of the report, it quite shamelessly dips into even the UFO literature. I mean, there are even photocopies. One of the amusing ironies of this is that there's a photocopy of something taken right out of my first book, Open Skies, Closed Minds, which was published back in 96. So it's a curious hodgepodge in a way, but certainly, yes. Go back again one step with this. Perhaps this is an important point for the listeners. One of the things that Project Condign tried to do was to say, look, we've been looking at UFOs for over 50 years, but we investigate these sightings on a case-by-case basis. No one has really sat down with an intelligence analyst mindset and done some trend analysis, pulled it all together and said, what have we got here? What are we dealing with? What do we think this is? And that was the central mindset behind Project Condign. Now, I was having discussions in certainly 92, 93 about this. I can't remember whether anyone specifically mentioned weaponization, but certainly in relation to the more interesting UFO sightings, people were saying to me things like, one of the reasons we should do this is clearly if there are craft performing speeds and maneuvers and other things that we just can't do, we're dealing with quantum leap technology, whatever the source. I want the avionics. I want to know about the aerodynamics. I want the propulsion system. I want the energy source. And yes, probably I want the weapons system, if there is one.
Okay. Now, that's interesting because some of this report goes into plasmas and stuff like that. But what you're going down the line of is it's clear that within, first of all, there's different agencies that would look at different things on the capabilities of this, correct? I mean, you'd have different agencies within the DIS and everything else. So if you had something that could do something on radar, there would be an agency to look at that and stuff. So there would be different reports out there classified within what this phenomenon's capabilities it's shown, correct?
Yes, and of course that's one of the huge problems with all of this. Everyone, and it's not just a problem with relation to UFOs, it's of course a problem that straddles all sorts of parts of the Ministry of Defense and indeed government in the wider sense. People work in silos. People have this very, very narrow purview sometimes. And part of that, particularly within defense, of course, is because of the security clearance. You can't just wander into the adjacent office and start chatting with someone and say, oh, I see you're working on this. I wonder, I'm working on something different, but maybe we should swap ideas. Now, maybe in the wider scientific community, that's exactly what people do. But in the military and in the intelligence community, because of the highly classified nature of a lot of this, people, as I say, they work in these narrow silos, and it's very difficult to get that cross-fertilization that you need if you're to make your real breakthrough discoveries. You can talk about exotic weapons, but there's a world of difference between a genetically targeted bioweapon and, say, a directed energy plasma.
Correct. Now, so here we go. We've got these different agencies. So he was asked to summarize all these different agencies' reports. Is that basically what he was doing?
Well, he was asked to really summarize yes, I think that's fair. What we had across the board, whether it's radar, whether it's with other areas, and go out in the literature. It was a real wide casting of the net.
Okay, now within that report, there was obviously some of the stuff wasn't even classified, right? It was just stuff, reports from people, what they've seen and everything else. But a lot of this stuff was classified, and what people need to understand, one of the things the MOD likes to say is, well, we released everything. Well, they may have released files, but they haven't released everything because a lot of it's still classified, correct?
Correct.
Okay, now, so he's got all these documents he's looking at. Clearly they were secret UKIs only. Was any of it top secret stuff?
I don't even know. I suspect it was. But here's another thing, and we haven't got onto this, but it's an important point, and I know you're aware of it. But again, listeners might want to just take account of this. This study, Project Condign, was commissioned by the Defense Intelligence Staff, which is part of the Ministry of Defense, but it was actually undertaken by someone who at the time was a contractor. In other words, he was working for a private corporation with which the Ministry of Defense did a lot of business on highly classified projects. But what that did, which is critical to the discussion you and I are having now, what that did is it took an awful lot of the working papers outside of the scope of the Freedom of Information Act, because it's only when something is in the Ministry of Defense that it's covered by the scope of the Act. Everything that happens outside where this study was actually done isn't covered.
Right. And okay.
So what comes back to the Ministry of Defense is, okay, I've had a look at this, here's my final report. The moment it comes back in, it's caught again by the scope of the Freedom of Information Act, but it's not caught up until that point.
Okay, but let's just say, for example, all right, there was a lot of missing files, correct, on Rendlesham when they came time to release this, right?
Yes.
If within these files there was stuff in there that they wanted to look at for weaponization, they could farm these files out to a defense agency outside the scope of the MOD and leave them with them, and that would put this outside the reach of FOIA or the release by the MOD.
You know, I think I'd almost need to talk to a lawyer to get you an answer to that one. I mean, the Freedom of Information Act is an incredibly complex piece of legislation, and simply moving something out of the department may not, in of itself, take the original documents out, because at one point you had the information, and I am struggling to recollect, and bear in mind, I've been out of this game for a while now, contrary to some conspiracy theories. But, you know, so I don't know. And the MOD has its own lawyers, of course, to go through stuff like this and to say, look, we must comply with the law, but, you know, obviously we don't want to give certain things away.
Right, I understand. But what I was getting out of what you were saying earlier was simply that when the files are removed out of the MOD scope and given to this like contractor, or let's just say given to a defense company, that would put them outside the scopes of the MOD, correct?
It would put a large part of it outside of the scope of FOI, and it would certainly put completely out any documents that were subsequently generated while the study was ongoing that did not originate in the Ministry of Defense.
Right. And then in Condign, and right, so let's just say you had this phenomena, they knew it existed, they wanted it studied. They could farm this out to a defense company and ask them to start looking into it, correct?
Yeah, and bear in mind, some of these people had higher clearances than we did, and that was saying something.
Right. And so they're working on this. And it's clear, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, because in America, this is going on more and more, that the MOD is out of the business of this, and even our government. And what they do is they hand this over to these defense companies because of, like Condign said, and what you brought up, is they're looking at this phenomena to weaponize it. So what do you do with it? You give it to the people that can turn it into a weapon, correct?
Yes, and if you look certainly at the boards of some of the big defense and weapons arms-making corporations, you'll see that they're at board level. There's a whole bunch of people who've just stepped out of DOD or you know, U.S. Air Force or wherever it is, and they retire from position as a general wherever they are, and they step straight onto the board of some of these private corporations. And, you know, sometimes it's pretty hard to see where one ends and the other begins.
And it's clear then that you wouldn't be wasting the time of the defense industry and the time and money and everything else, and they surely wouldn't be, because they're in it to make money, clearly, and to develop weapons, if this wasn't of defense significance, number one, and number two, that they're taking this seriously and they're doing everything in their power to understand this phenomenon and continue to work on weapons that they can emulate off the phenomenon itself.
That's absolutely true. I'd add one short caveat to that, and that, of course, it's the idea that industry does look at a lot of things that are not necessarily going to come to fruition. And this would be where you get into the idea of what you would term a low probability, high impact, or sometimes called low probability, high consequence situation, where you might be dealing with something where you would say, this probably isn't going to work. But heck, if it does, the payoff is so big that we can afford to throw a lot of time and effort at this just in case.
Right, but still, in this particular instance, though, they would have looked at the phenomenon itself and felt there was something within the phenomenon that they could try to test and try to work on, correct?
I think so. I mean, over 50 years of data, and I mean some incredibly strong cases. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying that this is a low probability, high impact. I'm just saying that sometimes comes into play with these sorts of research and development projects.
Now, with that in mind, we've made a huge jump in technology since World War II, right? You know, even after Korean Wars, when things really started changing, or you can even go say Vietnam is when things really turned the tide. Are there any weapons out there right now, based on what's been developed, based on the phenomenon itself within Condign, that you feel could have somehow been developed or partially developed based off the phenomenon itself?
I don't know, and if I did, I couldn't say.
Okay, that's fair enough. All right. Then my next question is, you made a statement one time that when you were in the MOD for the 3 years in the area, there were over 200 files that you had privy to, that if they were ever released would make some exciting revelations. Have those files been released yet?
Well, I can't actually remember making that statement, and I don't know where I got that figure of 200 from. I know for a fact, of course, we've talked about before, the Ministry of Defense have themselves admitted that some files have been lost, some files have been inadvertently destroyed. Hell, I don't know if you remember this anecdote, but do you remember the ship's log from HMS Manchester, which was involved in a spectacular UFO sighting, which apparently blew overboard as a result of a freak gust of wind? Well, this is the Undersecretary of State for Defense making this statement, not me. But so yeah, there are some things that have not been released. Well,
one quick question I have for you before we take our next break. All right, if the stuff, because there's a different level when you release secret, you guys are top secret. If it was top secret, could that just not be an excuse they use not to point? Because if you go into top secret, that's a lot bigger than even secret UK eyes only, correct?
Yes, I mean, before declassifying anything, you would have to go to what I think we in the UK would call the information owner and say, you are the person that owns this top secret information. You are the subject matter expert. We are thinking of releasing this. Do you as the SME, do you as the information owner, kind of do a threat assessment? What damage could result in declassifying this and releasing it? And if they come back, I mean, there's a strong presumption that you should release, but then if you get a strong enough argument saying there's a very good case why this should not be made public, then it will not be made public, and you'll get these documents like Project Condign, and then you'll get to a particular paragraph and you'll just see a whole rows and rows and rows of X's.
This is the premiere episode of Phenomenon Radio with your host, John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe, and tonight's very honored guest, Nick Pope. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Alternative talk you can trust. The X.
Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio with John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe, and tonight's special guest, former head of the UFO project at the MOD, Nick Pope. John, it's all yours, my good friend.
Thanks, Race. Nick, welcome back. Okay, we've been talking a lot about Condign. One of the things that came out, I think, of this report, or hasn't really been covered deeply, this report was never meant to be released, was it?
No, absolutely not. And I mean, when I was involved in the discussions that led to the setting of this thing up, I mean, bear in mind, the UK didn't even at that time, which was when, 92, 93, I think I was having those discussions, we did not have a Freedom of Information Act. Now, it was Tony Blair, when he became Prime Minister in 1997, he brought in the Freedom of Information Act. It was enacted in the year 2000. It did not come fully into force until 2005. So when we were talking about setting this up, and when the study was actually going on, we thought that this would never see the light of day. Before FOI, we had something called the Public Record Act, and the default position was that you'd have to wait for something to be 30 years old before you could even consider releasing it. And if something was top secret or secret, you just often waved a pen and said, no, keep it back, withhold it. And things would be withheld for 50 years, 100 years. Heck, I think some of the Jack the Ripper files are still classified. And that was, 1888?
Right. So Condign wasn't supposed to be released. Now, can you tell why and how it got released?
Yes. When we got our Freedom of Information Act, a whole bunch of journalists and ufologists started bombarding the MOD with requests, and there was one document that was released that had a kind of throwaway line that said something like, oh, well, we looked at this a few years ago in that intelligence study. And then people said, well, wait a minute, what intelligence study? And so a Freedom of Information Act request was put in for that. And at that point, it was realized that, particularly as the Ministry of Defense had been saying to Parliament, there's nothing to this subject. You couldn't then sustain that line that there's nothing to it and say, but I'm going to withhold this intelligence study. So they kind of got painted into a corner and thought, well, we have to release this thing. But it took, I think it holds the record, maybe with the exception of some papers relating to the Bloody Sunday inquiry into a series of tragic shootings in Northern Ireland. But I think it holds the record for the MOD document that took the longest for people to figure out how the heck they were going to redact it and get it into the public domain in a suitable way.
Okay.
And you've been through that document. You've read it, I know, probably closer than anyone on the face of the planet because of your direct personal involvement in all of this. And you know that just when it looks as if it's getting to some really interesting bits, suddenly there it'll be XXXX.
Right. And can you go, since you brought that up again, can you go into a few, I know you probably don't have it right in front of you, but there was a lot of stuff that's still redacted. Can you go into why it would be redacted and maybe a couple of things that were redacted and go from there?
Yes, I can't go into specifics of things that are in the report and are redacted, of course. But what I can say is that the reasons, the redaction, the reasons for those redactions really are all the sorts of usual exemptions that apply to particularly the more highly classified documents, defense, national security, intelligence. One of the interesting ones, and I don't have a sense of all the negotiations behind this, but one of the most interesting redactions is an exemption that covers information forwarded in confidence by an ally. So hypothetically, for example, if the American government told the British government something, but on the strict presumption that this was not to be made public, well, that's an FOI exemption.
Right. I saw that several instances where they didn't really say which government it was, but
yes. And I think for listeners who want to drill down into this, if you just Google a phrase like UK FOI exemptions, you will find the exact wording on the Ministry of Justice website, I believe. But it's out there.
And then another thing is a lot of it's defense. Now, I want your take on this. You worked in the government. You're out of it now. But how can you go on record, and you said yourself you used to say that, and say this is not of defense significance? And Lord Hill Norton didn't buy that at all, and he was way up there and would have had a very high clearance and knows a lot more about it than a lot of people do. He wasn't buying it either. How can you go out and say this is of no defense significance, not just Rendlesham, but UFOs in general, when a lot of this is classified defense?
Oh, I don't think you can. It's untenable. It's untenable. I mean, I felt when I was doing the job that the phrase "no defense significance" was ridiculous statement to make, and yet we consistently made it. To me, it was self-evident. How could you possibly, on one hand, say this subject is of no defense interest, when on the other, you knew full well that intelligence studies like Project Condign were going ahead at high levels of classification? It is quite literally Orwellian doublethink that comes straight from the pages of 1984.
Right. And the thing is that stands out to me is this, okay? When I did my FOIA requests, almost everything in there that's classified, actually not almost, everything in there that's classified then is still classified now. And did you get to read the report were you able to see everything that was redacted is what I'm going to ask you?
I genuinely can't remember. I mean, bear in mind this was, in my 21-year MOD career, I read such a lot, and sometimes I would see two versions. I mean, I've actually had jobs where I've been the one doing the redacting myself, and I genuinely can't remember whether I saw an unredacted version, a redacted version, or both.
Okay, fair enough. Now, on that note, I've got a couple questions for you. Number one, I find this interesting. Today, would you agree that most people don't really trust what the government's telling them?
Yes, I think that's true. I think that for a number of reasons, some justified, some not. But I think opinion polls will tell you, whether it's in the US, the UK, or wherever, I think trust in governments and indeed in institutions more generally, whether it's banks, whatever, is at an all-time low.
Okay, but isn't it ironic, though, that even though that's the case, they still really believe the government's going to tell them the truth on this?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so...
Yes, it's as if people are kind of somehow ring-fencing this subject and saying, well, I don't believe anything they say, except this.
Right. Now, when you worked inside the government, was there ever discussions within the people that you were working with in the DIS where they felt like they wanted to get this out?
Yes, I think there was one occasion. Well, not within the DIS. I mean, I think you could probably say that the default position of the DIS, it being an intelligence organization, is say nothing unless you have to, and then say as little as possible. I think the pressure was coming. It was coming politically. There were certainly some of the undersecretaries of state who I spoke to on this issue who wanted to get it out there. I remember on one amusing occasion, I'm not going to name him, but I received a call from the private secretary to one of the undersecretaries, and the private secretary told me, Minister wants a briefing on the UFO issue. And I was in security at the time, and I said, no, well, that's a job I did 10 years ago. I said, I can't give that briefing. It must be the current person, in whatever the division had changed its title to by then, Directorate of Air Staff, I believe. And the reply came back, oh, no. The minister doesn't want any of that no defense significance nonsense. The minister wants a proper briefing. And, well, it was like something from the comedy series Yes, Minister. And so this was a little bit subversive, of course. Somebody, not the current subject matter expert, but somebody who'd done the job 10 years ago, giving a brief on the subject. But I got permission from my current head of division, and it may well have put a few noses out of joint, but I gave the briefing, and certainly that meeting, I think, probably played a part in some of the declassification that came later, though, of course, the legislative pressure from the Freedom of Information Act itself was the main driver.
Okay. So to get this straight, number one, the MOD has gone a long way in releasing documents that they have. But in doing that, they haven't released everything just for the fact that a lot of it's still redacted, correct?
I think that's a really good, concise assessment of the current situation. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And based on your experience working in the MOD, there's stuff they haven't released yet, correct?
Not only do I know it, but they themselves have admitted it. I mean, both by virtue of the fact that there are still, for example, parts of Project Condign that are blacked out, and by virtue of the public statements that they have made about lost or inadvertently destroyed documents.
Okay. Now, in your opinion, and I say this because you worked in the MOD and you're now, retired from it, and you're out in the private sector, do you ever think there'll be a point where they're going to be willing to open up their books?
I don't know. I often like to say that this subject is events-led, and ultimately I think it's going to be driven by things that either happen or don't happen. And I don't know if we're going to ever get, I suppose, the sorts of disclosure that the UFO community talk about with the big D. I think as I said earlier, I think we've had disclosure with a little d. Whether disclosure with a big D will come, I don't know. It depends what people think there is out there to disclose with a big D.
Right. And as far as disclosure goes, you call it little d. There's some other people who've called it confirmation. What other than Condign do you feel that's happened out there that is set the public in the right direction for what's really going on, and understanding the fact that stuff's classified defense, they're weaponizing and everything else. But what are the things that people could go to based on your background in the MOD, not only in Condign but other documents you've seen in relations you had with other countries that have been released that are something that you could take seriously and build off of?
Well, I think your question gets to the heart of a big problem with the whole UFO subject itself, which is the signal-to-noise ratio. But I think that within the Ministry of Defense files and within the files of other governments around the world, there are a small proportion of cases which you could point to and say, look, forget all the crazy videos on YouTube and forget all the wild made-up stories, but this stuff is the real deal. The sorts of cases like Rendlesham Forest, the sorts of cases like the wave of sightings in Belgium in 1989 and 1990. A good rule of thumb, I think, is if you've got a general who's prepared to talk about it, it's probably a pretty good case. So when you talk about Rendlesham Forest, Gordon Williams has made some comments. When you talk about the Belgian wave, General Wilfried de Brouwer has made some interesting comments about the case. The Iranian sighting from 1976, well, Parviz Jafari, one of the main pilots involved, retired as a general. So those cases are out there. They're not necessarily classified. It goes back to, and again, I know you and I have had this discussion several times, that something is not necessarily even hidden. It's this old phrase that the best place to hide a book is in a library. The best place to hide a tree is in a forest.
Correct. And you made a statement a little bit ago saying that the MOD has made certain statements that clearly show that this exists and it is of defense significance. Do you have any examples of that?
Well, I think the paragraph right at the beginning of Project Condign was arguably one of the best examples of that UAP exist is indisputable. But I mean, I think it's more a piecing together of the puzzle. It's if you go further into Condign, when you get into the highly technical material, it's just the whole point. And you said it yourself earlier in relation to the private sector. It's these people don't waste time and money just for the fun of it. Intelligence personnel are not doing things like this on a whim. It's because people, a sizable number of people within the department, do think it's real and it's tangible, and do think that real tangible benefits will flow from a better understanding of what it is that we're dealing with. And those tangible benefits, I mean, of course, I hope that they'll be peaceful, that there'll be, for example, forms of cheap, clean energy, and things like that. But equally, I think human history shows us that there'll be the flip side to that. There's that line in the movie The Medusa Touch where the character played by Richard Burton says, we find what powers the sun and we make a bomb out of it. I think that's who we are, unfortunately, as a species.
So, since you brought that up, within the MOD, was that the biggest concern of all this? Obviously, if they're a threat to us, that's a good question. Did they feel this was a threat to us, number one? And number two, was that their second concern, besides it being a threat, as how to weaponize it?
Well, I'll make a slightly glib comment, and it's not meant this way, but the worst thing in the world isn't finding out that this can be weaponized. The worst thing in the world is finding out it can be weaponized and another country's done it first. That's bad news. Certainly if it's a hostile nation, self-evidently it's bad news. Even if it's a friendly nation, it's bad news because they get the economic advantage and you don't. On the question of a threat, it won't surprise you to know, and maybe in the US military you use the same thing, but we actually have an equation to define threat. And threat is basically defined as being a product of capability plus intent. Now, we know that the UFO phenomenon has a capability. We see it, and it's been well documented in everything from car stop cases to light beams firing down at the feet of Colonel Holt. What we don't know is the intent. So one half of the equation is missing, so therefore we can't say whether or not there is a threat. My view is always, in the absence of knowledge either way, assume the worst and allow yourself then to be pleasantly surprised. I think that's a better strategy than assume that it's going to be all friendly and everything in the garden is rosy, and then find out that was just wishful thinking.
Okay, now I want to bring up a case where that could be the exactly what happened. You once were on Fox News talking about this, and you made a comment about there were virtual dogfights, over the UK. So that must mean there was some kind of hostile intent there if there was a dogfight going on. Can you go into a little bit of that?
Well, maybe I misspoke with the word dogfight. I was certainly talking about a chase situation where we had a number of cases where UFOs were tracked on radar, and when pilots were scrambled, got fairly close to these things, they then maneuvered, evaded. We tried to reacquire, and that kind of process went on. Now, I think I may have, in the heat of the moment on live TV, used the word dogfight. I mean, I wasn't literally talking about opening fire on these things, though, of course, there have been a handful of cases where shoot-down orders have been given. The case of Parviz Jafari was one such case. We discussed that a moment ago, Iran, 1976. Comandante Oscar Santamaria Huertas from Peru, 1980. Actually fairly close in time to Rendlesham. And, of course, a big case from the UK where somebody came within an inch of opening fire was the Milton Torres case of 1957, where a UFO the size of a battleship was tracked on radar, and he was on the point, as a result of a shoot-down order, he was on the point of firing, I think, 24 air-to-air rockets from his F-84, when suddenly the craft accelerated away at Mach 10. And bear in mind, this is 1957. I'm not sure we have that kind of acceleration and speed now from a virtual hover, let alone 1957.
Is it still classified why he felt the need to fire on it? The contemporaneous government documents have not survived, or if they have, I've not seen them. He, a number of years ago, lodged an affidavit with his attorney to be made public either, I think, in the event of his death or as it transpired when the Ministry of Defense made mention of this, and they did. And he said, well, he was simply he was scrambled. He was the pilot on QRA, Quick Reaction Alert. He was the one scrambled, and he was ordered lock on and shoot down. Okay. So we got a couple minutes before the show closes. I want to again thank you for coming on. Why is Nick Pope doing this? I mean, you were in the MOD. There's clearly things you still can't talk about. What possessed you to leave the MOD and go out and start talking about it?
Well, I'm not a whistleblower. I did 21 years of Ministry of Defense work. The UFO project was only 3 years in a much wider career. I felt it was time for fresh challenges. When the Ministry of Defense started talking about this and declassifying it, the media got hold of me, and suddenly I was fairly free to talk about this. And the reason I talk about it is I think the quest for answers on this subject speak to the heart of one of the biggest and most profound questions we can ask ourselves. Are we alone or not in the universe? If we can help get an answer to that most big and profound of questions, let's do it.
Okay, now, big question, Nick. Based on, you have more knowledge of this than most because you work back behind the scenes of the government. Do you feel we're alone?
No, I don't think we're alone, and I think you've only got to watch the news over the last few months to see everyone kind of jockeying for position on this now, whether it's government entities such as NASA talking about the latest Kepler discoveries, or whether it's private initiatives such as Yuri Milner's breakthrough initiatives. There's been a ramping up of this, and clearly people are jockeying for position. People are racing to be first across the line on this one. Okay,
so in your history in the MOD and all the documents you had access to, is there any one document that you've seen that you feel that hasn't been released that could clear a lot of this up?
I don't think there's a single, I've used the phrase spaceship in a hangar smoking gun, but I think there are things that will take us further forward. Whether it will push us over the line or not, I don't know. There's probably a lot of stuff out there that I haven't seen too. And, of course, I only worked in the UK government. Goodness only knows what the US government has, but that's another story.
Okay. All right. Well, Nick, I want to take the time to thank you to come on our first debut show with Linda and I. I really enjoyed having you on. And I want to end this show with a little quote by you that you said years ago. It always has resonated with me, where you said, I've gone on record saying Rendlesham might be the turning point in history that leads to the explanation of UFO phenomena. So
yes, the things I say always come back to haunt me. But I stand by that. And, we've seen huge leaps forward in this case, as you well know, because you've been involved in most of them, if not all. And who knows what the next year or two will bring. I think I'm going to quote you. Is there more to come? Yes, there's more to come.
Okay, Nick, I really appreciate you coming on. And hopefully, when we get closer to December and the 35th anniversary, I can get you to come back on.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Folks, I want to thank you for joining in on our inaugural show. I want to let you know our next week's guest will be Colonel John Alexander. I want to thank you again.
Folks, thank you all for joining us tonight on Phenomenon Radio. Thanks to Nick Pope, Linda Moulton Howe, and our host and birthday boy, John Burroughs, for a fantastic job. Thanks for joining us, everyone.